Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. A very warm welcome to this month's episode of Keys, our monthly broadcast to our clients. We're so pleased to have you with us because we're excited to share with you the results of our latest Ipsos Global Trends study. It's the 9th edition. It's been going for 10 years. We have trends that we've been articulating and sharing. We have new survey of more than 40 countries, new analysis about how the world is changing, and we hope providing clues and advice and thoughts for all of us on where we go next. All of this, of course, set against the backdrop of those macro forces that influence the world, whichever country we're living and whatever work we're doing in our own particular context. To help us do that, I'm going to start. I'm in London today by building on that context and reflecting on some of those forces, but I'm delighted to have a wonderful team, genuinely from around the world, who are going to help us think through the findings and what they mean. So Jennifer, who's in New York, is going to be thinking in particular about the mood of the people, how they're responding to the challenges and the environment that they're living in today. We then have Mari, who is in South Africa in the Eastern Cape province, and she's going to be also thinking from a on the ground up view on how people are dealing with uncertainty in all its forms. And then we're going to be going to Patrick, where it's rather late in the day now, but he's with us in Beijing. Thank you so much for being back on the key stage once again, Patrick. And he's been looking at some of the signals of change and thinking about where we are heading next. We'd love to hear your questions, so please do put them in the box, and we will ask as many of those as we can before we finish. And just one other point, we are Ipsos. We do have a certain amount of PowerPoint to share with you. If you like the slides, don't worry, they'll be in your inbox tomorrow, so you don't have to put your pen into overdrive. We're very happy to share our analysis for today. So I'm going to start by thinking about that context, today's context, and I'm going to start with just one of the survey findings. It's perhaps the standout one that really helps us think through the context, actually, and that is around this decline in personal optimism. When we ask people how they feel about what the next period is looking out like for them and their family and for their community, the city or town where they live, we've seen this marked fall over the last year. We weren't finding optimism being particularly widespread anyway, particularly when we think about the world in general, but we were quite struck about the decline in personal, closer to home optimism. And it got us thinking about what's been driving that. And there are three macro forces in particular that we feel are particularly relevant. We have economies, if not turned upside down, they are having to be recalibrated in a more political environment than we perhaps have been used to. We have technology, the wonder and worry of all that that brings. And we have societies themselves feeling more in flux, perhaps, at least to certain groups, than they would like them to be. And those are the three forces I was going to just reflect on to set the scene, because this point about the economic recalibration, we're of course familiar with the context and what we've seen over the last year with the Trump administration's actions. We can raise many questions about where we go next, one of them being, have we reached the peak uncertainty, or are more uncertainty peaks yet to come? We'll have to see. But we need to remind ourselves that this isn't just about what's happened in the course of the last year, or maybe as a result of particular individuals. We can chart some of these economic changes over a longer period of time. If we go back 5 decades to 1975, those of us living in the highlighted countries here, I'm one of them, our countries contributed twice the proportion of world gross domestic product than we do today. Back in 1975, we were much more, let's say, in the driving seat, if I can call it that. India and China, 4 times more powerful in terms of their share of GDP than they were 50 years ago. Patrick, of course, is going to share with us perspectives from China in a moment. And of course, in the United States, where we have Jennifer, of course, speaking to us from there today. To use my best American English, the United States hanging in there as the number one. All of these are really important in terms of setting the scene, as indeed are some of the changes we've seen over that broad sweep of the years. We may not see it year by year, but over time, we have seen the world going into majority urban situations. That's where we are now. That's something that's embedded this century in low and middle income countries. We've also seen that when we think about the big cities and the big conurbations of the world. If we look at the top 15 in 1975, only 6 of them are still in the top 15 now. It's not, of course, that Chicago or London or Paris have gone away, but there are new poles of dynamism which are driving the world and big markets economies. Onto technology, of course, needs little introduction. We've all been thinking through what it means, the role of AI. One of the things we'll be closely watching, of course, is what happens on social media, with Australia being the first country to put its ban in place. Many other questions we can ask. What we don't know yet is what the long-term impacts are going to be, whether it's around our social skills, our working lives, or indeed the security of our data, but certainly something that is always there in the background and the foreground of our lives. And onto societies, some very visual reminders really of, let's say, some of those divisions, questions that societies are asking themselves, and it doesn't always feel particularly comfortable for governments. Can any government really keep a grip on the forces at work? And again, this isn't just something about the last year. Again, if we're looking at that longer sweep of changes that take place over time, and this is why we call them the macro forces we can't avoid, we just have to deal with them. Of course, we have life expectancy rising. We know that, but sometimes we need to be reminded by looking at just how much that has risen over time, and of course the pressures that places of aging population on societies and on governments, because of course that's accompanied by having fewer babies. More than 30 countries, including China, now losing population. And again, what we're seeing in some markets, of course, is immigration filling the gap, as some might call it. Certainly the share of foreign-born population rising in many countries around the world, which of course brings with it a range of different questions. So huge amount of flux, it feels, when we're looking at today's context, but a reminder really that sometimes it's good for us to think about that longer term sweep as we think about what the next 10, 20 or 30 years are going to bring. So that's the macro forces. I'm going to hand over now to Jennifer, who's been thinking a little bit about how the public, people, citizens, consumers, whatever you want to call them, how does it feel for individuals on the ground, Jennifer?
Thanks, Simon, for that. And there are 3 key themes that start to come out of this as well that very much are showing how citizens are feeling, how they're reacting. And this is part of how we look at change, that we're looking at not just what is happening in the macro environment around us, that things like technological change, environment, political change, but we're really homing in on how are people responding? What are the patterns in their behavior and in their attitudes that help us understand what the lived experience is within this environment? And the first theme here is really about one of the things that Simon touched on up front, that we're still really divided on this view of whether globalization is good or bad for us on a personal, professional, community and country level. But we have seen one big shift since last year, and that's shown here in the sense that 65% of people, up considerably from 2024 when we last asked this question, now think that there are too many immigrants in my country. So it's a direct reflection, not just of what's been happening in terms of trade policy and concerns about how that's impacting our wallets and our livelihoods, but also about the broader shifts that have been happening, to Simon's point, over a long period of time. The shift in power structures, the shift in who is in control and how in control we feel in our own countries and in our own lives. Part of that is also really reflected in the tension here, or the kind of split that we still see, where over time, over the past 10 plus years that we've been running this study, we have seen a general uptick in people agreeing that globalization is good for my country, and people agreeing that globalization is good for me personally. So those measures have gone up in most countries for the most part of the last decade. But it raises this question about, what does the reality of that look like in people's daily lives? How confident do they feel about the future? And how are they feeling about their country's role on the global stage? And we start to see some interesting things come out in a new question that we asked this year for the first time, in direct response to some of the things that have been happening in that macro environment. So we asked whether people felt there should be more trade barriers to limit imports of foreign goods and services in my country. And of course, the hypothesis was that we would see some big responses to this. But what was interesting, and you can see it as this was populating, there's a big distinction between individual markets. You know, perhaps the most vocal one this year has been the US administration trying to set the agenda for trade policy, and how distinct that is from the way that people in Mexico responded. So again, we're asking consumers how they respond and how they feel about some of these measures. But it's also interesting to see, even in individual regions like Asia, how distinct those differences are, perhaps influenced by culture, perhaps influenced by trade policy and how people feel about their country's role on the global stage. How interesting it is to look at the differences between, for example, China, Japan, and Malaysia. So lots of things that we can unpack and dive deeper into the study with clients, but really interesting to think about not just the global direction of change, but how individual citizens in different markets across the world are responding to those same stimuli and those same macro forces. The second theme that I wanted to call attention to is around technology. And we talked a lot in last year's report about this tension around technology. And part of that is driven by the sentiment that, you know, on the one hand, we need technology to solve future problems. And we were really heartened to see how much this has shifted up. You know, that more than 2/3 of citizens now feel this way about technology's role in our lives. And that may create a real mandate for tech companies to be able to solve those bigger, trickier, thornier social problems that are really at the crux of what's happening in the world. But there are also still concerns around what technology means for our individual lives and for us collectively. So one of the other things that we looked at here was really thinking about, is technology good or bad for us? And we've asked this question on the left for a long time, and we've seen a steady increase over that period, that now over half of citizens globally think that technical progress is, quote unquote, destroying our lives. So there's a very real fear, and some of it is hearkened in what Simon was talking about earlier around the impact of social media, questions around AI, but impact of technology writ large on both our society and our individual behaviors and abilities. At the same time, the positive side is that we're seeing a big increase, even just from last year, in people thinking that AI is having a positive effect on the world. So as people are adopting it more frequently and using it more frequently, lots more momentum for this and positive sentiment around what AI can do for us and with us. And that's really interesting to look at as well when we start to dive deeper into regional attitudes. So while more than half of people globally feel that AI is having a positive impact, there are still some questions and there are differences across different markets. So for example, Singapore being much more aligned with this sentiment of positivity around AI, France being much less aligned, very similar to a lot of markets in Europe, and Colombia and Latin America really being kind of in the middle of those two ranges. So we can certainly dive into individual markets and look at regional perspectives and think about, how do policies, how does access to technology and broadband internet, how does all of that affect how people feel about AI and feel about their livelihoods and their future in that era? The third trend that we wanted to touch on here, or the theme that I should say within the trends, is around brands. And we've seen that brands, personal values, and even identity and how people define their identities remain some of the biggest and strongest trends in our study. So this one here, for example, that we tend to agree that we buy brands that reflect personal values. Nearly 2/3 of global citizens agree with that. But more importantly, it's gone up steadily since 2013. So in this era of thinking about trust and who we trust and how we resonate with brands versus institutions versus individuals, brands really have a big play here to make and a big role in people's lives. And with that, we've seen that there are certainly growing expectations for brands to get it right. And I think a big upside for those who do. For example, this metric that I'm generally willing to spend extra for a brand with an image that appeals to me speaks to not just the importance of a brand alignment with your values, but also brand's responsibility in terms of representing you to the public and thinking about how do we as brands leaders reflect both that vision of what brands represent about us, if we're aligned with them, if we're wearing a brand, for example, but also how does that align with our values? And really a lot of interesting opportunity areas start to align when we think about the brand's role in this future. And the last point that I'll make on that is kind of tying back to the international trade policy and how people are feeling about globalism, in the sense that a lot of people, more than 2/3 here, almost 3/4, are turning to local brands and products. And we start to see a lot of interesting distinctions here as well between markets and around different regions. Certainly some being more preferential toward local products, whereas less preference in some places that you might have expected it, like the United States. So certainly some of that is changing, and you'll see that in the public report. But really interesting to think about, how do you as a global brand either dial up or dial down that globalness, or how do you, sitting here in America, how do you as an American brand navigate this in an era where there's a bit of a question about America's role on the global stage and how important it is to be seen as an American brand versus a global brand? Many brands have kind of walked that line very carefully this year. And in fact, we just released a new Brand America study that dives into that deeper.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think that Brand America study we'll put in the show notes, actually, because it is very interesting, and whichever country we're in does, as you say, raises questions about, let's say, our country's brand and whether how that resonates when we're selling them or in other parts of the world. Thank you, Jennifer, for that overview. And Jennifer's been one of the lead researchers on this project. And actually, with that in mind, Jennifer, what is your main piece of advice, really, as a seasoned trend watcher, for those of us who perhaps have done less of this than you, but want to really dive into this kind of material?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I think is hopefully evident from what we're going to talk through today, not just from this section, but that Mari and Patrick will touch on as well, is it's so important to pay attention to types of change, not just the signals that we see in social media, in the news every day, but also to take that step back and think about the broader macro context as you were speaking about and understand how they're connected. And the second piece of advice is try and see the opportunities. I think it's so tempting to look at these headlines and look at even some of the results of the study, to your point about a decline in optimism, and feel a little bit disheartened. And I would say, as a brand leader, as a policymaker, as a citizen, how do we turn that around and think about it as an opportunity and frame challenges as opportunities and think about the way that we can act on it and help citizens navigate this territory?
Lovely, thank you for that. And talking of opportunities, dear clients on the call, you have the opportunity to ask questions of all of our panelists as we go through. So do put them into the chat, and we will come back and have some conversations with each of them right at the end. Thank you for the moment, though, Jennifer, because we're going to now move over to Mari in the eastern province of South Africa. And Mari, you've been thinking about this from a kind of bottom-up angle, and helping us also, I think, to understand a bit more about, from the context point of view, different countries and different cultures. So thank you for the work you've done on this study and for sharing your perspectives today. Over to you.
Thank you, Simon. We saw this morning that the broadband in South Africa is not always broad. So if we lose sound again, I will switch off my camera and we will go on from there. Change and uncertainty is very uncomfortable to people. And yes, it doesn't want to move. So you might please move my slides. Thank you. You can move one on, please. I did say that the broadband is not so broad. To shine a light on how citizens around the world react to change, I'm going to look at 3 of the 9 Ipsos Global Trends. The one is called Escape to Individualism, then Nouveau Nihilism, and then a retreat to old systems. How do these trends manifest themselves in the lives of citizens or of consumers? And yes, please. First of all, I think there's a certain choice fatigue coming through because there's increasing choices in terms of brands, in terms of products, in terms of whatever aspect of our lives. The choice is just humongous. Then secondly, for some people, they say they only live for today because the future is so uncertain. Other people put a big stress on that we need to save because we don't know what's coming in the future. So everybody knows that the future is uncertain, but people react to it differently. And then lastly, we see an alienation that leads to a nostalgia of the past. And yes. A lot of people say they often feel overwhelmed by too many choices in life. You can see the slide is fairly complicated with the results of all 43 countries. But if we look at the proportions just in general, we can see that this feeling of being overwhelmed is actually quite prevalent all over the world and quite universal. We see that on the one side, Hungary, France, and Croatia don't feel as overwhelmed as some of the other areas. For today, because the future is uncertain, we see the 3 biggest or the 3 places where this notion is the strongest, being Thailand, China, and the UAE, where they feel that it's important to live for today because the future is uncertain. We get the same notion also again 2/3 of almost 2/3, 65% saying the important thing is to enjoy life today as tomorrow will take care of itself. China and the UAE again on this list with almost the same proportions as before. Denmark, that reacted very differently to the previous question, now saying 88% of Danes are saying for them the next day seems very unpredictable. Therefore, they do live for today. But the majority definitely believe that it's important to save today because the future is uncertain. This 83% that's the global country average, saying that saving money is important at the time of uncertainty, is one of the highest percentages or proportions that we saw in this particular study. Again, we see China featuring very highly here, 93% saying it's important to save. And we've also seen the fact that Chinese people like to enjoy today because the future is uncertain, and also enjoy today because you don't know what tomorrow will bring. I think in most cases we can live with these seemingly opposing views in our heads. Most people do that every day of their lives. And that cognitive dissonance is not really an issue because that's the way we are human after all. We also see that people, and again more than half in every country that we surveyed in, are saying the government does not prioritize the concerns of people like me. So citizens are definitely feeling that that they are being neglected by their governments. The government's focus is somewhere else, or they have different priorities, but they are neglecting their citizens and don't prioritize the concerns of people. And yes, and people are saying that they would like the country to be the way it used to be. I am not sure that these constructs of what it used to be is really very helpful. What they look like, we don't know. But probably it refers to a time when life was simpler and perhaps less dangerous, less uncertain, and in general, just not as complicated as it is today. So lastly, I want to go back to where I started and look at the different trends that we studied up to now. And really, it moves from a sense of broad demographics that don't really work when you look at your target market anymore. Your research and planning must definitely have a human face. Yes, thank you. So the trend manifests in personal autonomy that people see as the most important value. They want to carve out their own path, and they want other people to know that they carve out their own path. They accept that there are alternative paths to success. You don't necessarily climb the corporate ladder like 10 or 20 years ago, and they certainly want a work-life balance. Nouveau nihilism manifests itself in this feeling of living in the moment, in the disenchantment about political systems, people that feel neglected by their governments, and the establishment feelings, definitely a deep-seated angst about the future, and then, therefore, a shift to shorter-term decisions. And then lastly, in the retreat to old systems, we see the relatively harmless thing of nostalgia and traditionalism, people hankering back to an imagined and sanitized past to a great degree. But you can also see things like the rising nationalism and populism that can be dangerous. Those strong political streams that we see in a lot of countries, or immigration and diversity that are facts of life. But I think different societies and different individuals and communities react differently to issues of immigration and diversity. So we definitely need to take all these things into account when you work with developing messages or products for different people in the world in 2025. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you, Mari, for preparing that for us. And yeah, a live reminder of perhaps how we sometimes need to be a little bit careful, at least depending on where we're sitting, with just assuming that all technology works perfectly everywhere. As you said, Mari, I'm going to steal your quote. Your broadband isn't necessarily that broad. We know that many people are online, but they may not have a smartphone, even today. And we know that people with smartphone may not have huge amounts of data to play with. So just a little bit of a reminder, certainly to people like me, for waving my hands around and just assuming all of the tech and the AI is powering X, Y, and Z. Yes, it kind of is, but not everything is stitching together quite as we might think. And with that in mind, and as a keen a watcher of markets across Africa, what has been the impact on technology on kind of economic change and development? Because it has still been a really important dynamic, has it not?
Well, Simon, tech definitely changed things in Africa to a large degree, not only in markets, but also on the side of information and the availability of information. we, I think, leapfrogged a lot of developments in the world, because some areas like in South Africa and Namibia, there were old style telephones, but in a lot of other areas, there were no telephone lines, no telephones in home, and no infrastructure for telephones. But the growth of mobile telephony has been just absolutely amazing. Not necessarily only smartphones, as you mentioned, but on the other hand, it's not only having a phone, but the enablement that the phones bring. A lot of you might have heard about the M-Pesa system. It was developed in Kenya to basically to facilitate payments or the sending of money from the African diaspora to people in Africa. These days, basically in all 53 African countries have their own system of e-wallets, as some of them call it, or yeah, or whatever the name is, but it facilitates the payment of money to people who do not have bank accounts. A bank account is one of those things that is not just a given in Africa. You might, or the majority don't have bank accounts. So we see basically that fuzzing of the lines between banks who sell cell phones or mobile phones to people and provide contracts on the one hand. On the other hand, mobile companies acting like banks. So that is a very big thing. And I know that on the healthcare side, a lot of people are so far away from a clinic or hospital that they can't get their chronic medicine. One of the things that is being looked at the moment is to deliver medicine to faraway clinics by drone. Or to people who live in very remote areas, to deliver the medicine by drone. So it is really, there are so many things where technology can play a role in the development of literacy, of education, of human rights issues, and whatever you think is AI technology really having a big influence in Africa at the moment.
Thank you for that, Mari. And questions for Mari, please do put them in the chat and we will follow those up before we finish, or indeed after the show. So that's really wonderful sort of overview. And actually you're segueing into our next presenter, because Patrick, who is a friend of the Keys show, by the way, so we're delighted to have you back again. I know, because I've seen his presentation, he's going to be talking about technology as well in a moment. But also, Patrick, you're looking ahead and just trying to think about where we may be heading, drawing on the Global Trends study and indeed your experiences more broadly. So thank you, Patrick, for sharing us your perspectives. Over to you.
Thank you, Simon. And as everyone knows, it is important to understand the trends, but it's also important to watch for the signals and also understand how to successfully activate the trends in your local market or in your sector. So I'm going to cover 3 trends and their practices in the China market. The first one is Techno Wonder. Mostly we talk about how people have conflicted views about technology. However, if you compare by different markets, you would realize that China is among the very few who embraces the technology the most and worries the least. Even with that as a background, people still have very different views on certain functions or certain technology adoptions, like AI customer service. Many people felt it really only benefits the company, and that already reached 26% of people. And still also we have 20% of people who believe that AI customer service can benefit the consumers the most. The good thing is, as Jennifer mentioned, people are being more welcoming or open-minded about the new technologies and AI. So this number of people who believe they benefit the consumers actually increased by 3% compared to last year. This also has something to do with the development and the improvement of the Chinese large language model, especially the one called DeepSeek. This is seen as the major technology breakthrough in China this year, and they really improved a lot ever since they launched, and they reached to the tier 1 LLM in the beginning of 2025. And this also leads to something very interesting. Jennifer also mentioned that in China, many people tend to buy local products, and this is also true to the AI technologies. And when we asked whether when the local LLM started to emerge, most people said that they will trust a company more if they incorporate the China-made LLM in their products or their brand. But this shows us sometimes how two different trends, for example, techno wonder and globalization fractures, can work together and push to some signals. The second trend I'm going to mention is conscientious health. And health is not a new topic, but the thing that really changed in the past several years was the importance of mental health. And that's especially true in China market again. How that is reflected in brand management is in the past, many local brands really focused on price and the functionality advantages to promote their brand. But as more people are paying attention to mental health, actually the importance of emotional benefits becomes so high. The emotional ratings in our tracking actually jumped above the functional ratings ever after 2017 and kept at a high level. We saw some very good examples of brands who adopted that idea in their practice. And the first example is a toy company called Pokemon. They are famous for selling like the hidden figures. So when you buy the product, you actually have no idea what is exactly in that box and you are buying. Their net profit grew by more than 300% in the first half of this year. Many people believe that's because it's not just a toy, but it's the anticipation before unboxing. And you can see when you unbox, you see different stuffs. And that's a daily dose of comfort that you can get at a lower price. Another good example would be the growth of the music concert in China in the past 2 years. You can see the revenue actually tripled within 2 years. And we interviewed many people, especially young people. Some people said they even went to 5 concerts by the same band in a row within a month in the same city. And the reason is they see that as a weekly emotional release to restore their mental health after a long week's work pressure. So the last thing I'm going to mention is the power of trust. And as Jennifer mentioned, around the world, people are willing to pay more for the brand who have an image that appeals to them. And again, this number is extremely high in China, especially in the most recent update. We see this happening in many different sectors. And one sector particularly is the outdoor sportswear. So the sportswear brand Arc'teryx actually did pretty good in this. They're charging premium, but people are paying for that. And their revenue also grew by a big number in the past year. And their brand claim is connecting with the mountains is our reason of being. However, the example of Arc'teryx also reminds us how cautious we have to be if we are charging premium because of our brand propositions, because they are running into a big crisis actually just this week. So this brand, their most recent marketing campaign was a big fireworks show in the Himalaya mountains. And as you can imagine, many people are worrying that this could do some serious damage to the environment. And as a brand who claim that we should be closer and more friendly to the environment, this is something hugely wrong for their brand image. And this is having a big negative impact on the brand right now. The trend is also true not just on daily wear, but also on some very expensive stuff like cars. So in new energy vehicle purchase considerations, you would see that among the top drivers, when people are trying to make a purchase, the top 4 are all about brand trust and brand image, especially if the brand provides a feeling that this is a brand for me. There is a local brand who did pretty successful in this. This is a brand called Li Auto. When they launched their MPV series, they integrated the concept of home. What they're trying to convey is to make sure that this is a more like moving living room for everyone in your family, no matter if it's he's a child or elderly, they should be able to enjoy themselves in this MPV. And they are targeting at the people who perceive themselves as good fathers of the family or someone who are taking good care of their families. So let's see how they perform, how this strategy works out. This is a very competitive market. So you have Tesla, you have BYD, and Tesla is the leading brand around the world, and BYD is the best seller in the market. Both of the brands have very strong brand image and brand desire by different consumers. They are perceived as technology advancement brands. Tesla is considered as the leader in the world. BYD offers a good price and also good quality. So how did Li perform under this competition? Actually, they did pretty good by the strategy. Most people mentioned this is a brand for family. Many people mentioned they provide spacious interior and they're very comfortable, very friendly to the family members. So even under serious competitions, you can try to win by finding the right brand image. I'm going to end by 3 key takeaways. This actually is a quote from Jennifer, even though she didn't mention today, she mentioned this in this report. So making sure you can activate the global trend successfully in your market, make sure you can demonstrate local value in a globalized world, try to build trust in an era of skepticism, and also try to provide solutions that offer a sense of control. And back to you, Simon.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick, for that masterful overview of both the international context and some of the experiences that we're seeing on the ground in China. I was fascinated by your point around DeepSeek and that connection, let's say, between both the technology and what it can do, but also the affinity that people in many markets have with their own local brands that comes from here. Can you tell us a bit more about AI and how it's been adopted by Chinese consumers in recent times?
Yeah, it's really widely adopted nowadays in people's daily life, and especially on some things like medical advice or legal advice should be very professional stuff. However, the answers provided by LLM like DeepSeek was incredibly accurate. Usually their accuracy can reach like 95, 98%. And also a lot of companies are using the LLMs in their products, whether you are an internet company, a search engine, a mobile phone company, or a consumer electronics company, they really adopt that a lot. And I really like the name, they call themselves DeepSeek because it's really a good way for you to have deep thinkings and deep conversations with the AI technology.
Thank you for that. And actually, I've got a bonus question for you that's just come in. We're talking to you live, folks. So I've got another one straight for you, Patrick. But it's somebody who's particularly interested in this willingness to spend extra for a brand, who's a brand whose image appeals. Anything particularly you've seen in success in China in terms of brands that have been able to both perhaps charge that little bit more, but perhaps offer that little bit more to the consumer?
Okay. Actually, many brands are doing this, and if you are so again, a sportswear brand called Lululemon, that's a Canadian brand, right? And actually, their manufacturers are based in China. So you somehow, if you want to find similar quality stuff as the brand, you can find a bunch of other brands in China. But still, most people are paying like 50% more for that brand, because they are creating the environment and brand belief of a new lifestyle. It's more like everyone should be able to work out, should be able to have a healthy lifestyle, and they are building up the communities for this group of people. And this is also true in all kinds of different car brands. Even though the car competition is very fierce in this market, international brands are still using their accumulated advantage of the brand image in the past 30 years to charge a little bit more, even though there is terrible price war right now in the market.
Thank you for that, Patrick. And that sort of segues into a parallel question. So I'm going to come to you now, Jennifer, because it's perhaps relevant to what you mentioned around the American brands, but thinking about the domestic market this time. And it's this sort of question about, on one level, people in principle like the idea that brands align with my own values, but of course we have this polarization, and it feels like that's the kind of essay question to work through at times, because if you communicate in the wrong way, you will actually presumably alienate the people that matter to you. So any advice for us as we think about how we, let's say, get the balance right, if that's the right way to express it?
That's a great question, and I think there are a couple of ways to approach that. One, first off, is to know your consumers, not just through studies like this, but to really hone in on who are your current and prospective consumers, whether that's through segmentation, through looking at updated attitudes, and really talking to them and getting to know who your current and prospective consumers are really deeply. So I think I have to say that, right, as a market researcher in Ipsos.
Okay.
But I think the other piece of it too is about language really matters. And oftentimes we've seen, and this is some of the work that we've done, in particular in my market around the New America, that shows that we oftentimes agree more on the concepts of values than we realize. And so if you start to really carefully look at the words that we're using, there are oftentimes more citizens agreeing on a particular value, but the flashpoint happens when you use a politicized term. So, you may talk about family and, the importance of family life and the home, but if you use particular terminology, it becomes a flashpoint for liberal versus conservative. So I think in that sense, again, it's about knowing your audience, but also using the right language and making sure that you're aware of those watchouts.
No, that's a good point, and actually, again, something we'll put in the show notes. We've got a new piece out this last week from senior communications professionals. We call it the Reputation Council, and in the context of ESG, they are clearly actually very clear that actually some of the positive messaging around sustainability can really make a difference and be a really important force for them. But you can see an acknowledgement that the term ESG is being used less, and even within the internal context. So that's points well made. Mari, I'm going to come to you now. We've been asked about what were the findings were there any findings that were particularly stunning to you, or that had changed in particular? Any stunning findings that you spotted as you were sifting through the data?
A lot. That's the short answer. The one thing that really struck me was how different countries can react to a thing that you think, where does this come from? It was interesting for me, for instance, to see Croatia a lot of times almost at the bottom of the list when we come to those things about do you think that that issue about the perplexity comes with a lot of choices? Croatia, France, whatever, at that side of the scale, they're not really they don't express the same almost fear for choices. It is as if they just get on with it. And on the other hand, there were a few countries that had the same issues again. Well, I talk about my own place, South Africa. A lot of times when the questions were about social or political things, we are not happy. We could see that clearly coming through. And for a long time, we saw people not being happy with the direction the country is going in. But now we also express it in other things, saying the government is neglecting us, all those sorts of things. I knew it was there. I didn't know it was so strong, perhaps. And I thought it would be stronger in different other places as well, like Argentina or in Mexico, in Indonesia, wherever, where there are lots of demonstrations and things. And you know what really is amazing about the results of the RGT? You can look at this and you think, why is this country here? And you go and see how the lived reality of people manifest in the streets or on the articles that you can read about it in the newspapers, and it's like a mirror image of what we are doing, how it manifests in real life.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Very points well made. Thank you for that, Patrick. I'm going to ask you actually as well. Was there anything that you found particularly stunning or surprising in the results as you were looking at them in the round?
Actually, I was really shocked by knowing that China is the country who embraces technology the most, because I think that's also the beauty of global trends. Sometimes when you live in the market, you take certain things for granted. I mean, living in China, I saw like the whole world loves technology and have very little worries. But it turns out that's very different. And that also leads me to think that as a lot of Chinese brands are going global, it is really important for them to understand that difference, because in China they are used to the easy life of just by promoting technology and then winning customers, but seems that's not the case for them anywhere else.
Yeah, so that's very wise advice for all of us. Actually, we often think about our mental maps. We're often very much thinking about what we're used to, what we've grown up in, where we've been working. And very, very wise advice. Thank you for that, Patrick. And we're gonna finish with Jennifer. I've got one point of clarification and then one question, if I may. Actually, but it comes back to the country analysis, because one of the clients on the call was interested in the other areas that we can cut the data by. So we can look at it by country, but we've got all the regular demographic groups, haven't we, Jennifer, in the analysis, if you want to look at it by age or generation or family context, haven't we?
Yeah, that's correct. And I think it highlights that, we're talking about global top lines here as the public report, but with any client, we can dive into any of the standard demographics, from gender to household income to education level. I think the other interesting thing is that we can also cut by psychographic. So amongst people who answered this question, how did they answer the rest of the survey? So there's sky's the limit in terms of how we can slice and dice this.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you for that. And then just to leave the final word with you, actually, Jennifer, because I know you've been poring over all of the analysis. If we were giving you more time and asking you to come, start a new presentation, what's the one thing that you would have liked to you'd like to share with us that we haven't heard so far in the webinar?
Oh gosh, maybe that's connected to the last question, is what is really driving that decline in optimism? I think we're rushing to report on all of this, but that's one that I really am excited to dive into. A little bit concerned, but I think what's interesting is that I've seen some studies come out recently that anhedonia is one of the most commonly diagnosed psychological issues. It's the ability to feel joy, essentially. I think that's very connected to what we're seeing in this study. So I would actually love to connect what we're seeing with some of not just the macro forces that you talked about, but what else is out there in terms of the psychological profiles of the world. And that's coming soon. Hopefully we'll be able to write some articles about that. But I think it's fascinating and also concerning for us to think about, what do we as researchers, as brand stewards, as policymakers, how do we address that, and how do we help people through this era?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a very good point. We've got our new Global Health Service report coming out next month, and as part of it, we've been charting the rise of mental health as an issue around the world. One of the things actually I'd like us to do more off the back of that is to think about this point about language, because there are some positives now that people are increasingly able to talk about things, but there's a lot really to try to unpack, because without giving away all the findings today, it's front and center as a big concern. But then again, the younger you are, the more willing and able you are to talk about these things. So lots to unpack and think about. But back to today, this I hope has been a really good entree into some resources that we hope you're going to be able to use in your own work and in your own particular organization. So we have the reports and presentations like the ones you've been listening to today. We've got the macro forces, which is packed with secondary data that we could find, and we particularly tried to do that 50-year sweep, as you saw from me at the start. And we've also, actually, to Jennifer's penultimate point, we've got lots of opportunities to interrogate the data by subgroup or indeed over the years. So thank you for being with us today. We hope we can be with you to help you answer the burning questions facing your organization. Be in your inbox tomorrow So look out for that. Thank you, Agnes, by the way, who's in Paris. So we're completely international team. And Agnes, thank you for your support. And indeed, Emily, who's been helping us with the questions. Thank you for driving Mari's slides. Agnes, that was very kind. And we will be back in about 6 weeks' times. Hopefully it won't be too depressing, but I've managed to put another marker because we're looking at the middle classes. Are they in crisis or are they not? But we're going to be looking at the middle classes around the world, how we define them, how we're thinking, and how we can get close to their motivations and explore how we can serve them, their needs as we look towards these uncertain times in this uneasy decade. We hope you have a great rest of day, rest of evening, rest of morning, wherever you may be, and thank you for being with us. We'll see you next time. Thanks again to all of our presenters.